Maybe folks could, somebody could pass those out. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right. So we were on chapter 16, which is the 7 bowls of God's wrath, last week. And I wanted to finish up with the 7th bowl. And that's in the last part of chapter 17 or chapter 16. So if you could turn there real quick, we'll go ahead and read that. And I think that's a good lead into chapter 17 and 18, which I feel are really a double click or a deep dive into that 7th bowl, which is the wrath of God. And so in chapter 16, starting in verse 17, I'll read. And the 7th angel poured out his bowl upon the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne, saying, "It is done." And there were flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder, and there was a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. And the great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. And huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because its plague was extremely severe. The reason I wanted to finish this piece is because in chapter 17, we're going to talk about the doom of Babylon. And chapter 18 is going to continue on to the Babylon has fallen. And then there's going to be a lament for Babylon at the end of chapter 18. And so I think it's important to kind of understand that this is the final judgment. If you remember, there was partial judgments from the trumpets. And now we have the final outpouring of God's wrath in the 7 bowls. And the 7th bowl is really upon Satan and Babylon. And if you look, So the 7th bowl, it's poured out into the air. And I think this air here represents Satan. We know from Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2, that Satan is described as the prince of the air. And we also know that Satan casts darkness over the air and torments those who do not have the seal of God on their forehead. That was back in Revelation chapter 9, verse 2, which was when we were talking about the trumpets. All right? And I also think that Satan was the power behind Rome, and Satan failed when Rome failed. So we're going to talk about that more in chapter 17. So Satan used Rome to attack Jesus in its infancy, and then Satan used Rome to attack the church in its infancy in Revelation chapter 12. And if you remember, that description was of the woman, right? And the woman had a child. Well, the woman, and I think it was William who preached that night on Revelation chapter 12. It talked about God's people across dispensations, across the Jewish or the Mosaic dispensation through the church. And we see that Satan was persecuting all aspects of it. First, persecuting the woman, then persecuting the child that was born by the woman, which we know is Jesus, and then was persecuting the church. Then Rome fell because Rome persecuted the Christians, and we see that in the 7th bowl, but not a lot of details. But the more details are going to be in chapter 17 and chapter 18. One other thing I think that's interesting is the thunder, lightning, and earthquake. That comes, we saw that when the 7th seal was revealed. We saw that in the 7th trumpet, and now we're seeing that in the 7th bowl. I think that represents God's involvement in this judgment, which is what I just said there. All right. I think the other thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that God remembered Babylon and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. Remember, at the very beginning of the outpouring of the bowls, it was in reference to the winepress of God's wrath. This is the culmination here. So Babylon, as the center of the beast empire, represents that empire. It is the embodiment of human pride and rebellion against God. It is mankind in organized opposition to God and in opposition to God's people, the saints. And that is why its destruction is given such elaboration in chapters 17 and 18. All right. Last thing I think I'll say about the seventh bowl is it pulls us back to the Egyptian plague with the hail, plague of hail. There's a number of examples in the Old Testament where, in addition to the plague of hail in Egypt, where hail is used as judgment. God used hail to rain down on the Amorite army in Joshua 10:11. And it's interesting that when God was speaking to Job in the cloud at the end of the book of Job, that he said that he reserves storehouses of hail for the day of battle and war. That's interesting. All right. So now let's transition to chapter 17. So I passed this out, and I think this is a helpful, set of verses, really, but it's clues that gives us some clues about the beast from the sea. It brings us back to Daniel chapter 7, Revelation chapter 13, and Revelation chapter 17. We're going to read about that here in Revelation chapter 17, but I wanted you to have this so that when we read through this, it'll bring remembrance, and then we'll give the interpretation of the beast from the sea and also the harlot that we're going to read about. So I'm going to read chapter 17. And one of the seven angels had the seven bowls, came and spoke with me, saying, "Come, here I shall show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on the scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And upon her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. And the angel said to me, why do you wonder? I shall tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss and to go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth will wonder, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. And the beast which was and is not is himself an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings which have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. All right. I'm going to finish the chapter a little later. So this is fairly complicated. There's 2 main characters in this first chapter in chapter 17. One is the harlot that's sitting on this beast, and then second is the beast itself. And I thought it'd be best to talk about the beast because we've seen this beast before. We saw it when Rocky taught Revelation chapter 13. It was a beast coming out of the sea. And that was Revelation 13, 1 through 8. Now we're seeing it again. But we also saw it in Daniel. Now, if you guys remember, we went to great length and we talked about, this is a slide when we were talking about Daniel, if you remember that, for those who were here. We read Daniel chapter 7, and it had these 4 beasts coming out of the tumulus, or the rough waters. And we said that the waters was the peoples and the nations. Well, 4 beasts came out. First, we translated that beast to be Babylon. Second beast represented Media, Persia. Third beast represented Greece. And then the fourth beast being Rome. Well, it's interesting that Revelation pulls us back to Daniel. How do we know? Well, if you go to Revelation chapter 13, verse 1 and 2, it pulls us back to Daniel. And specifically in verse 2, this is in the description of this beast. And this beast is described in verse 2 of chapter 13. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his throne and great authority. And so we see that the beast description is really an embodiment of those preceding kingdoms. Babylon was the beast that was like a lion with wings of eagles. It was the second beast was Persia, which was like the bear, and then third beast was Greece, which was described like a leopard with 4 wings. Only in Daniel, it looked forward, because Daniel was written 600 years before. It looked forward, so it described it in the sequence of the Babylonians, which was where Daniel was basically captured and taken away as a slave and spent his whole life in Babylon. Then Daniel experienced the transition and the defeat of Babylon to Persia. Then he prophesied about Greece in chapter 8 and a few of the other chapters. And then ultimately in chapters 11 and 12, some of the greatest historic prophecy that was fulfilled describes the transition of the Greek Empire into the Roman Empire. But here in Revelation, it looks backwards. And it shows this beast as having aspects of all those prior beasts. And I think what that means is it ultimately is describing that Rome embodied all the wickedness of the preceding kingdoms. You know, from secular history, we know that Rome adopted all the Greek pagan mythology. A lot of times they would change out the name Zeus for Jupiter and so forth, but it was basically the same thing. It was an adoption of all their idolatrous practices. And it's also interesting, too, it's worth going back to Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 2. Now remember, when we spoke about Daniel had 2 visions that were kind of similar, only different descriptions. One was of the statue, when Nebuchadnezzar had that dream of the great statue. And then there was a boulder that was cut out, not with hands, and it destroyed the statue. And then in chapter 7 is the 4 beasts, but those are all represented those 4 kingdoms. And so if you go back to Daniel, I think it's interesting to see here some of what Daniel says. Let's see here. Let's start in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. And this is in reference to Rome and these other 4 kingdoms. But in verse 44, it now is talking about the divine kingdom, which will destroy these kingdoms. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. notice that these are all destroyed at the same time, which is kind of interesting because we know that the physical power was taken away a long time ago. At the time of Rome, these other kingdoms had basically disappeared. I mean, they were still there, but all their power and dominion was taken away from them. And that's explained then in Daniel chapter 7, verse 12. Daniel chapter 7, verse 12 says, and this is the vision of the four beasts, but it says, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. Well, I think that appointed period of time is what we're talking about right now in Revelation chapter 17. All right. So if we go back to Daniel chapter 7, what do we see? And I've got the cheat sheet, so I'm not going to go through it all. But we see that the fourth beast is the Roman Empire. And then we see that there's 10 horns, and those 10 horns represent kings, 724. And then we see that 3 horns are uprooted by an 11th horn. This is the little horn that speaks blasphemy against God, verse 25. Persecutes the saints, verse 25. And interestingly, alters time and law, verse 25. But then we see that the court sits for judgment. His dominion's taken away and annihilated and destroyed. I think that these 10 kings are what you see here. And the 11th king is Domitian. Now, if you start with the first Caesar, and a lot of people think of Julius Caesar as being the first Caesar, but he really wasn't because he was under a republic. Now, he wanted to be a king, and he acted like a king, but he officially wasn't. The first emperor with full power over Rome was Augustus. And the first dynasty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, ends with Nero, which is the 5th Caesar. And then you have 3 Civil War kings or Caesars that ultimately only reign for a few months and are eliminated all in AD 69 by Vespasian, who was the 9th Caesar, and then Titus was the 10th, and Domitian was the 11th. Well, if you go back to Daniel chapter 7, it's interesting because the way it's described is those 3 Civil War kings. It doesn't call them Civil War kings, but 3 of the horns were uprooted, pulled out. And this is in Daniel chapter 7. Let's go back there for a second. And I think it's verse 24. And as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will rise, and another will rise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones and will subdue the 3 kings. Now that's the interpretation, but when we read it, it actually talked about these being uprooted. In verse 8 it says, while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. So if my interpretation is right, and a lot of people view it the same way, then Domitian is that 11th horn. And the 3 horns uprooted would be the Civil War kings. Now, if we go to Revelation, how does that tie up with the same beast? Well, in Daniel, the kings are represented by the horns, but in Revelation, the kings are represented by the heads. Now, there's also 10 horns also representing kings, but we'll get to that.